Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I suppose that most of you were already here yesterday, so in fact I don't have to introduce our demonstrators again, but for those who only came today, here on this side we have Tony Tickle from the UK. We have Ryan Neal. I don't have to say something about Ryan Neal. Everybody who knows him. New for us at the trophy is Minoru Akiyama-san. Has already been many times in Europe, but it's his first year here at the trophy. Yeah. Then another one. Do I have to say your name?
I don't know. Maybe.
Do you know him? Yeah.
So today I'm gonna kind of style, even for the first time, this tree I have for 20 years. This is the first tree I bought from Japan when I still was at university. So it's been a long time ago. Was a gift I did for myself when I graduated at university in Venice for architecture, and I saved money a long time to be able to buy this tree. At that time was a procumbens juniper, a Yamadori from Japan. I was so proud of this tree, and in 2005 actually I showed this tree at the Jinko Award. Then because procumbens is not really the best variety for foliage, I decided to graft Itoegawa. So on one of my many trees in Brazil, I found this very nice and tight variety of Itoegawa that old generation Japanese people moving in Brazil bring there. So I bring some cutting back home maybe 7 years ago, and 5 years ago we graft 130 sign graft on this tree, and then I let the tree grow. And in the last year I just take care of getting the new graft stronger and remove completely the old foliage. So now the tree is 100% Itoegawa juniper. So what we're gonna do today, we're gonna kind of resparkle the tree, cleaning the trunk, cleaning the liveline, because the graft, some of the liveline grew a lot because the new foliage is calling for a lot of energy, so some of the liveline really thick up, and I wanna just give the first setting of these new lines, try to bend some of the longer branches down to create a nice shape. So basically it will be kind of a refinement for this tree, and then along the way I'm gonna tell you some of my ways to graft and why I do it, because we are doing a lot of grafting recently in Italy and in Europe to change the foliage of junipers. Thank you.
I'm Mr. Akiyama. I come from Japan. So this is the second demonstration he's doing. This is an Ezo spruce that we'll be working on today. And so the character feature that Mr. Akiyama has kind of like sort of seen and wants to sort of focus the design on is this this dropping branch that's from here. And so the movement in the trunk is it's very sort of subtle but very interesting. There's no sort of straight sections within the trunk. Has a lovely sort of elongated feel, which is sort of typical of spruce. The only problem with the design at the moment, the branches at the moment, is mainly to do with the apex, and that if he's looking to make this side the kind of the character branch and the tree flow across to the left hand side, the apex of the tree is moving very much across towards the opposite side of that. And so just by lifting it up a little bit on the right hand side here, bring the kind of the center of gravity of the apex a little bit more across the center of the tree. And by sort of pruning the branches and wiring them a little bit, we'll be able to bring the apex a lot more across, moving in harmony with this dropping branch. And so making the most out of this branch is going to be the sort of the key challenge for the design. And so if we can get the most out of that branch there, then the rest of the tree will kind of like be relatively easy to finish off. So the biggest problem in order to make the most out of this branch is to deal with the fact that we have 3 branches coming from exactly the same point on the trunk. So there's the main character branch, which he's looking to use, this big, thick, heavy one on the other side, and then some back branches. And so in order to help with accentuate the flow of the tree, the direction, we're going to cut this branch off on this side. And we're going to make that into gin, and then start styling the rest of the tree. Okay, so that's going to the start of the design, and that we're going to sort of take it on from there. So we will hand the mic on to the next person.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for turning up. Let me just say that Ryan has questioned my masculinity because my tree is so much smaller than everybody else's. You know, there's supposed to be a special relationship between the English and the Americans, you know. Well, you're not going to screw it up now, are you? So what we have here is, it's a Yamadori yew that's from England. It's Taxus baccata. And in honor of what's going to happen next year at the trophy, the special award is going to go to Windswept. So as you can see, this is sort of a windswept already, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it more extreme. There used to be a saying, and it was, if you can't make a good tree, make a windswept. Whereas in actual fact, windswept is probably one of the hardest styles to execute properly. And I know certainly when I spoke with Christian, I said, I'm going to do a windswept yew, and he was like, a windswept yew? Are you sure? So, and here it is. This is actually naturally, as it was collected, it has actually been sandblasted. I have sandblasted this, and that is the natural color. There is no gin fluid or anything been put on this. This is actually the natural color, and I quite like that silver color. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to tilt it over slightly using the table, and I'm going to be wiring it. I'll probably be using most of this foliage, and I'm going to pull it closer, so the whole thing will be a much tighter design.
Happy Sunday, last day of the trophy. Everybody is always much more docile today than yesterday. You all look very quiet, probably hungover for the most part. No? Everybody's shaking their hand. No, I don't get hungover. Okay. So yesterday's tree I was really excited to work on yesterday's tree. I'm really nervous to work on today's tree because this is a tree that I originally styled in 2015 in Saliu. And there's a long-standing debate in bonsai about how do you get the structure of a high alpine species like a spruce or like a mugo pine to hold its structure over the course of time. And one of the things that was interesting is this was styled in 2015, very, very heavily styled in 2015, and was unwired from the look of the branches and everything long before it had ever grown enough to hold any remnant of the shape that we created in 2015. So then when I saw this at Danny's place, I recognized the trunk of the tree, but it looked as though I had never touched it in Saliu in 2015. And so I thought, I can come back and I can redo it because there were some things that I would like to do differently about what I had done in Saliu. And now 5 years later, I've learned a lot about bonsai, and I thought maybe we can make it a little bit better today. Okay? So first things first, the entire character of this tree is extremely powerful and extremely strong when you look at the base of this. It has fantastic, wonderful, beautiful features, incredible deadwood. The base is a little bit awkward, but we can change that and make up for that in the angle of the tree that we choose. Before we choose the angle, though, whenever you have this kind of power, it starts to create a singular concept for the design in terms of big, broad actions in the structure. And that big, broad action is reduction of the height or compression. Okay, so if I want to make this trunk the focal point of the design, I'm going to reduce the height and the distance that the foliar mass exists away from that trunk. And what you can see when you look inside of this is you can see that the upper trunk doesn't have any of the quality or character that the lower trunk has. It's extremely straight, it's extremely boring and uninteresting, very young looking and very youthful looking. We have to change this, otherwise we're putting a very young image on top of a very old image and there's no consistency to our design. Okay, so the first move that we're going to make before we start playing with the angle and finding that front and setting our defining branch and all of those other things is just to compress and really bring focus and attention down around this really old trunk. And that'll be the first beginning of the process of remaking a tree that's already been made, but we're going to do it better the second time.
I'm actually going to put this English U onto another piece of the same rock. Ryan has said, will it fit in there, because he thinks it's really quite small, but in actual fact the stone has been prepared and has got a hollow in it, and it's got brass screws that we're going to attach copper wire to, and there's a mesh there which is actually covering the hole. You can see it here, that has been drilled through with a diamond drill. This is extremely hard stone and it comes from Scotland. It's called Devonian schist.
Grafting junipers, especially in Japan, when obviously they're doing bonsai longer than us, is already a technique that is going on for so many years. So changing foliage that is not so good and suitable for the bonsai refinement especially. So the research of the most tighter and finer foliage, especially with Itoigawa and Kishu, is going on for many, many years. They select and reselect subspecies of Itoigawa to have the best foliage, and in the same time have also trees and cuttings that they elongate very fast, and in the meantime they keep the characteristic of the small foliage, because you know you can get a tree that when you prune is nice and compact, and as soon as you let extend, you lose some of the characteristic. We have this problem with some Sabina. We collect Sabina in Spain, especially where we can find the best varieties, that they are super compact for the condition, and then as soon as we bring home, we start fertilizing, we start giving good light, we start giving good care, they elongate and they lose that tight foliage that they normally have. Most of the time, and one of the biggest problems, especially with Sabina, is that the foliage become weeping. So start weep, is not able to hold itself because the conditions are different. The tree is used to grow, for example, in a very dry and alkaline surface. So you pot in Akadama, you change, you give a lot of fertilizer, and then the foliage change. But there are some type of juniper, especially Itoigawa, that it's very difficult to make it change the type of foliage. Some Itoigawa tend to, if we stress them too much, tend to become spiky, but most of Itoigawa, or especially the varieties that are selected for be grafted on other juniper, they never change their characteristic. And this is the good thing. If you want to design a tree and work a tree in the long run, we don't want the tree to change in the worst. We want the tree to change in the best. So the foliage get tighter, we can go more definition in the pad, we can create structure, and especially when we have to build structure, we need line that can elongate, and then as soon as we start shorting those lines and moving back the auxine in the inner part of the trunk, the tree get denser and denser. that's the good thing. I was impressed to see this year at Shinji Suzuki Garden, one juniper that was grafted probably 10 years ago with a very good variety of Itoegawa, and the tree was completely down with no wire, beautiful pads, everything holding itself. That is another problem of most of the type of juniper. Again, for Sabina juniper, most of the Sabina juniper has a so fine and tight foliage at the end that they always have to be wired to be refined, even the good foliage. But again, Itoegawa, for the type and the characteristic has, you can have pads that in time you go and you remove completely the wire and the tree get refined and perfect. So I was dealing so many years with these procumbens, and every year, procumbens kind of renew the foliage, so all the older foliage get brown, and the younger foliage is nice and blue. But every year you have to re-clean and re-clean and re-clean. And at the end of the story, I was bored, and I said, okay, I'm gonna graft it. Originally, like 10 years ago, I thought, grafting taking a long time, and then you never know, and you lose the shape of the tree is already done, it's a pity. But for the long run, I will never go back and keep this tree on the original foliage. And now I'm grafting most of my Sabinas and some other juniper. I graft the Communis juniper in the Dolomites. We have what they call Communis alpina. Most of the time we find very good trunks, but again, the foliage is no good. So I'm grafting most of these trees with Kishu or Itoegawa. Recently I worked a Sabina grafted with Kishu, approach graft, not sign. And, it's totally a different world. So talking about grafting, there are two ways basically to graft a tree. One is approach graft. So you take a little plant with roots, you approach to a live line of the new plant, and then you make them match. And in time, you remove, if you need the foliage, you remove the roots, or reverse, you remove the foliage and you keep the roots eventually if you need to add the roots or, separate a part of the tree. This tree, as I said, was grafted, sign graft, because I had already a structure, a main structure of the tree. I just need to change the foliage with the fine lines. So that's the reason why we sign graft 130 graft, and I think maybe 100 took. And now, after 3 years, we are ready to create the new pads. Basically, what I do, if it's a Yamadori, a material that was never worked before, and I already decide I want to graft, I do the approach graft. Otherwise, if the tree has already a structure like this one, I do sign graft. This is the difference on the approach of grafting I use. One of the secrets for the sign graft is the aftercare, in my opinion, because when we cut a little branch from a juniper and we add to a new branch on the original tree, what we have to do is keep that little cutting moister until it will not start sucking sap and water from the other tree. And this is going to take a week, 10 days. So if we aftercare in the good way, using the bag technique, or what I do when I do a lot of sign graft, I completely bag the tree and I put in a shady place. So having the bag, a transparent bag, is making kind of a greenhouse inside the greenhouse. So I hold a lot of moisture on the tree, and this is helping the little cuttings to take. I'm not a big fan of the original technique of putting the plastic around the cutting, because I feel you risk to make this little cutting rotting, because there is a lot of moisture just in touch with the cutting. So that's the reason I use the plastic technique. I bagged completely the tree, I tape the base, I just water once, and then I leave it there until I don't see the little cutting look good. And then I start poking holes, so I allowed new air to go inside and moisture to come out. But then at that time, after 2-3 weeks, the little cutting, you can already see if you went right or wrong. If it went wrong, you can put still another one. So this is how I normally do.
So as we saw right at the beginning, we removed that branch that was on this side, covering up the trunk and made it into a gin, and now what we have on this side is a lot of space. A lot of people will be scared of space, but Mr. Akiyama was very kind of like insistent on creating that space there. And so, by changing the angle of it, the sort of the center of gravity of the tree has started to move now across towards the left-hand side. And so, what we're going to do to kind of continue that movement is to drop this branch down. So that's the next major sort of manipulation to be done. And so it's going to become into a little bit more of a sort of a slanting style. Try and get as much movement out of this branch and elongate them as much as we possibly can on the left-hand side.
Okay. So generally, whenever you're trying to like really compress something, it's going to be a series of multiple bends. So what we did first is we attached a guy wire to this piece right here, and really what we wanted to do was take that very vertical piece out of it. Got it to arc a little bit, but there's not much that you're going to do to change the structure of that wood because it already is so rigidly straight. But we did pull it towards the back, and we secured it to this piece of deadwood here. Then what we did is we came back up top here. We applied a wire, we hooked in between those two pieces of wire right through the crotch of those branches, which is an awesome pull point. Goes right through the center of that vascular tissue, doesn't do any damage, and gives us maximum amount of leverage to then compress this upper apical piece. So when you look at it, what was sort of this piece here is now here, and we're going to further compress. But we don't want to go too far before we know whether we have the space for everything else in the design. So what we'll do now is we'll establish that angle, probably looking at establishing our base here, so showing that really rugged trunk, and then set this defining branch and start to get a feel for the size and proportion of our tree.
I will always advise to choose the outside and pick maybe between 6 and 8 centimeter of the length. The other thing is you see the change of color between the wood. So I always advise to graft where the wood start becoming brown, not the green one. Is a little bit stronger, and it can hold a little bit more moisture rather than just the tip. The tip will dry out very fast. If you graft and graft inside the part that is has already wood, brown wood, is a little bit easier.
I've just wired the top half of the tree. You'll notice all the branches are going in one direction. I'm not really creating big foliage clouds. The reason being is I always like a tree to have a story. The reason the tree is cascading, the reason the tree is going upright. What we've got here is that originally this tree would have been vertical. As you can see, these were roots, so it's fallen over. So this is a natural position for it to be. And what you've got here is the foliage. The live vein is underneath the tree, so it's in the lee. All the wind and all the rain and the hurricanes and stuff are coming from this side. But this has managed to stay alive because it's not being hit by the weather. So hence the reason why we've got all the foliage on this side. Also want to show you around the back here. This branch was originally attached to here. So what I've done is I've completely hollowed out the whole branch down here. You can see it. We've got the camera on it. Yeah, there we go. So this has been completely hollowed out, probably around 6 years ago, and the callus has started to come around, and it's kept it in this position, which was always the position I wanted it to be. I was preparing this tree to be a windswept probably 6 years ago, and really for today. So you don't see this scar from the other side. This would have been a nice side, actually, for the windswept, but because of this, it's a little bit ugly. Hence the reason why this is the front.
Okay. Can I just show them the front real quick? Okay, so, and Troy, can you just rotate with that block? Yeah, okay. So, front tilted up, we're expanding the base a little bit with what we're showing in terms of it was a little awkward, a little bit weak. Expanding that width just by bringing some more of that trunk line down into the soil where we'll have that formation of the base. You can see the compression now, and the big thing with this piece is because we've got that really strong base, kind of like yesterday we had to strengthen the base with the move that we made. Today we're showing that base, we're showing that ruggedness of the trunk, we're showing the mass of the trunk, but I still want that length laterally. We said we're going to take the height out of the tree vertically, but we're going to expand the length laterally. We pulled this branch back, really rigid branch, and the shoulder was up like this, and we pulled the shoulder down like this, and it pushes that branch out laterally. But in order to be able to move that, we had to cut a wedge out of the backside of that branch's shoulder. Super, super common technique. Very fundamental pine technique for bending because pines can move resources laterally as well as vertically. So now we're kind of working on trying to figure out what this foliar mass, we talked about it yesterday, that's what gives us all of the proportion and perspective, size, design, density, etc. for the rest of the tree. And this tree, in terms of its growth, 5 years ago, all of these branches were about half the size. So with the expansion of foliar mass, we get the expansion of vascular tissue, which means the branches get bigger. So now we're using heavier gauges of wire to get everything moved. And in general, when we talk pines, the fact that that needle mass is what expands that vascular tissue, that's also what gives us back budding. So if you look on the interior of this tree, there's back buds everywhere, everywhere. And I think there's a general impression that to get back budding, you got to pluck all the needles off. This is like the opposite of getting back budding. This is like preventing back budding, plucking all the needles off. So even as we're styling today, we're leaving a lot of older needles on the tree as well as last year's needles on the tree to have as much needle mass as we can to facilitate the continued perpetuation of health, but also reducing enough so that we can aesthetically manipulate the branches. And this is the balance. I would leave as many needles as I possibly could on a pine and still have the capacity to wire it and style it and make it look attractive. The only reason I would remove needles on pines is to be able to wire it and style it and have it look attractive, okay? So the notion that needle plucking or needle removal on pines is something that is is desirable is completely incorrect. This is something that we do for the aesthetic practice, but the more needles we have, the better back budding we will get, okay? So we're gonna let those continue to drive back budding. We'll get this dialed in, but definitely the compression that we're seeing and this branch having that angle change. We said, listen, in Soliu in 2015, I couldn't make, in that first go around, all the changes that I wanted to make. Now I get to make those changes and continue to improve the tree. Had this tree continued to be worked, the progress we could make today would be exponentially greater than what we're going to be able to make, right? So it kind of went forward, and instead of continuing to move forward, it went forward and it came back. Now, it didn't come all the way back, but it came back pretty far, so we'll only be able to go past that last aesthetic just a little bit, with a little bit of improvement to some of these structural pieces, but in general, it should give us something a little bit better today. Yeah, so I won't cut back a tip unless there's a bud that I can cut back to, and unless I have a significant needle mass still present, right? So like when you look here, I had these big, long, strong pieces. I have two buds that are much smaller, much more proportional. And typically when you start to talk about the move from a tree that you're growing out to get really strong, when you start to transition into a more refinable, distributed energy in the tree, that initiation of that distribution comes with the clipping of those tips, because you have those back buds built, you have those finer branches starting to accumulate, and you're ready now to distribute energy to those. Because ultimately, when you talk about a pine, they grow in a conical form, as most conifers do, based on their hormonal content of auxin. And the auxin is stored in the tip of that branch. It's produced in the tip of that branch, it's produced in the tip of the root. Transports via water from the tip of the root to the tip of the branch. The branches that transpire or lose the most water are the ones that accumulate the most auxin from the auxin produced in the root tip, okay? Because all of these branch tips are producing the same quantity of auxin. So the one that transpires the most is the one that gets the most from the root tip, and that's what gives you the offset of auxin to create the conical form. Well, when you cut that off, when you take that auxin out, you allow cytokinin to move into the branch, and cytokinin is what causes lateral branch growth. Auxin suppresses lateral branch growth, right? So when we cut that tip, we start that move towards all of those buds that we've generated via the accumulation of that needle mass, which has given us vascular tissue, which has given us back budding, which we can then drive energy into. Does that make sense? Yeah. Always build the bud, right? People's impression with bonsai is you make a tree back bud. This is the wrong idea, right? You don't make a tree do anything. These are antiquated concepts that have caused a lot of failure over the course of bonsai's practice in the Western world. You encourage a tree to do something. And when you think about it, the more needles this tree has, obviously the stronger it is, because it's generating all of the energy. This is a solar panel. So if you cut off or you pluck off all the solar panels, the tree will respond in stress with back budding. It doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be a positive thing for the tree, or it can actually take those buds and drive them forward. But if you utilize this needle mass to build those buds and continue to utilize the needle mass to feed and facilitate their expansion, this is how we get a tree to rapidly increase its density and ramification. Okay, so here's the next part of this equation, right? We have a Yamadori tree, and we get this tree super healthy. And a Yamadori that is all twisted and contorted, you start giving it all the water, all the nutrition, this very friendly environment, and it starts moving back towards a very youthful form of growth. That's what we want. That's energy, right? That's the accumulation of needle mass, accumulation of vascular tissue. The tree gets younger, physiologically younger. But in that youth and all that movement of water, you get massive auxin accumulation, okay? So when you start to say, I want back budding, in order to get back budding, you have to lay the structure of the tree out. Have you ever seen like a glass jar filled with oil and water? This is like, we used to do this in preschool when I was a young kid, right? Oil and water. And the oil would be on the top or the bottom? Top, yeah, there we go. Oil's on top, water's on bottom, right? And the water can't get past the oil. Okay, so think about this like auxin is the oil on top, and cytokinin is the water on the bottom. Now, when you take that glass jar and you dump it on its side, both of those pieces can now move through that cylinder. So when you take a vertical branch, auxin is on top, cytokinin is on the bottom. Auxin is suppressing lateral bud growth. Cytokinin wants to promote it, but it can't get in. And when you lay that down laterally, now the auxin runs up the branch, cytokinin runs down the branch, and just by changing the position, you initiate back budding. Now, whether or not you want to transition energy from the tip depends on, do you have enough length? Do you have enough thickness? Do you want more accumulation of needle mass and vascular tissue, right? But just that simple act of laying it down is what initiates the back bud formation. Yep, you got it.
And so the image that he has in his mind and that he has of Ezo spruce is of their natural habitat and how they grow naturally on the island of Ezo, which is up in the north of Japan, also known as Hokkaido. And it's a very snowy place. These trees get covered in snow constantly throughout the winter, obviously, not during the summer. And the snow weighs the branches down and makes them sort of sag down, become very elongated and droopy. So that's the image that he's looking to sort of recreate with the branches. And so when you see the trees sort of in the wild and as they kind of like get collected as well, there's very few trees with low branches. And so there's always the branches from the sort of the top of the tree get lowered down in a way that sort of represents their natural kind of growth habit, their natural environment. So when we're creating sort of foliage pads on junipers, looking at creating a lot of volume, so sort of foliage pads with great volume to them, and so utilizing sort of up and down movement within the branch, within the sort of the branch tips, in order to have sort of secondary branches and foliage kind of like growing up off of the top of there, creating volume to the foliage pads. Very similarly done with pines. But in the case of the Ezo spruce, what he's looking to, and particularly this tree and this styling, is looking at creating quite straight branches, which are sort of have little movement within them, and therefore have little volume to them. So they're really quite sort of flat. The one thing that's sort of common to both creating foliage pads with junipers and with Ezo spruce is the desire to kind of like fan the branches out, so that all of the sort of the secondary and the tertiary branches are have their own space to grow into. We've got sort of sufficient airflow through the tree, and all of those branches are getting sunlight, and so they're able to thrive.
So I've pretty much finished the wiring, but not necessarily put the final positioning of the branches, for the simple reason it's a challenge when you put it on a stone. You're never quite sure what's going to happen to the root system, so these things may move. I may reposition them. The stone has already been prepared by my good friend Terry Foster. He used a diamond cutter to scoop out a cup at the bottom and drill a hole through the bottom as well. And we use roll plugs and brass screws screwed into it. And I've fitted 1.5mm copper wire. And you can see they're really long. And the reason they're really long is I'm never quite sure how big a dome of soil and Kato will be on there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take it out of this pot, check the root system. When I was at home a few days ago, I actually put a screw into the bottom here. And what I'm going to do is on this anchor here, it'll be the counterbalance to stop it falling over. And if you look here, you'll see there is, I don't know if the camera can see it, a little wire that is actually anchored onto that gin, just holding it in place. Because obviously there's a lot of weight and the counterbalance going over this way. Windsweeps invariably work best on a slab because it's a very natural form. And as I say, it's not an easy style to execute. And particularly yew is an unusual species to have windswept. But certainly up in the Lake District, which is in the north of England where I live, you see these windswept yews and they're incredibly flat. You know, they can have a very straight trunk, but on the top they're extremely flat. So this flat styling is in perfect keeping with the trees where I live, the look of the trees where I live.
We are kind of halfway up on the tree. You see on this side, I already start creating pads, lines, open the vegetation, start dividing in the different green masses. When we push down these whips and we have foliage all around, the part is going to be the bottom of our branch. We're going to clean, and so we can open the side little branches right and left and still have foliage to start creating the volume. But obviously we don't need the foliage underneath the branch. While I push those lines down, I also try to give a little bit of movement, not too much, would be unnatural, but a little bit of movement and set them in the different position and create kind of a rhythm up. It will be kind of a pretty dressed tree with compact foliage. And while I'm finishing working this side, I will start also pushing down that big branch in the opposite side to counterbalance this visual weight. And then at the end, I have a lot of foliage here, so I can create a nice and compact top already. Obviously on juniper, especially when we graft, most of the strength is on top. I was trying to give always a lot of light on the lower part to not lose too much strength, so I can create the lower branches as I can create the top. The tree look pretty equal, but obviously I have some big whips there that I will use to cover some empty spot, because obviously I couldn't graft on the very old wood, so I will need some young branch to cover that area and create more pads.
So it came out of the pot really nicely. As I've had this tree for a long time, so it had a really good solid root mass. My experience with yews is I can take it right down to that much, which has taken about 50% of the root out of it. And what you can see there is a remnant of the dead wood that went down into the ground. I'm going to saw that off so it will sit really nice and flat in the stone. There's also another piece there, so I just get a sharp saw and I'll saw those off. And then I'd like my assistant to come and join me. I'll give you the nod when we're ready to go, okay?
Getting up near the apex, and it's always the way that an apex is created is a big transitional arc over the course of time. When this tree was originally designed in Soliu, and I already cut off, I thought about, here it is. Okay, when it was originally designed, all of these interior buds that are present now weren't here 5 years ago. So when you start to think about just the notion of compression, and you have this branch sticking up in the air and you lay it down, your apex essentially is just another flat pad like a branch. And this is the very fundamental shape of an apical region when you first create it. But again, just the same discussion as we had actually, is it Philip? Philip? Yeah, Philip had asked, I've got a tree that's super healthy, I can't get it to backbud, and we talked about the oil-water, auxin, and cytokinin relationship. When you lay that branch down like this, all of a sudden along that branch you get all these backbuds, and that's what all of this finer, tighter growth in here in the apical region came from, because it didn't exist. It was built. So now when we come back and we work this 2, 3, 4, or now 5 years later, we're going to pull off a lot of those big, long pieces that we had laid down because they've continued to grow. And as they've grown, the interior pieces have become far more compact. And we get to shrink that apex down and actually start building that more reminiscent structure of an apical formation we're more familiar with in the bonsai form. So that's really what's happening here. And it's fascinating. We said we'd get to take it a little bit farther. The apex is actually going to be the piece of this work that evolves more than any other aspect of this tree from the first time that it was styled, because we have so much more on the interior to build with. To the degree where you can see how big and long and coarse these are, we now see the proportion of our tree. We want a relatively small apex, right? This big, massive, expansive apex that we've kind of become used to and accepted. This is the product in Japanese bonsai of 30, 40, 50 years of that tree continuing to grow and expand, and nobody choosing to pull it back, accepting that shape. But that's not necessarily what we want to create, and that's not what we want particularly in a very young stage of the tree's existence, because then it only gets bigger from there. When you have the ability to pull back, you need to pull back. That apex should stay relatively small. On most trees, apical regions are quite small, unless we're talking about a coastal environment or something of that nature. This is a very alpine form. Is this tree reminiscent of a mugo in the natural environment? Probably not. Probably not. The material gave us more of a bonsai form than it did a natural mugo form, and maybe that wouldn't be as interesting for this particular piece. So I'm going to continue to come back and take out these big coarse pieces and start to shrink down this apical region. We'll reorient some of these, probably reduce it even further, and really get that nice, small, refined apical region as the big step forward for this piece.
So you can see Philip did a really good job helping me. We got it exactly in the right position in the pot. The angle is correct. It was fortunate that I put the screw in before we came. And you're probably thinking, where is the left for the roots to go? Because you've taken everything away. Well, in actual fact, the Kato is going to be built up from here and all the way around this area here. So there's all this area for new roots to grow. This will probably need to be repotted maybe every 3 or 4 years to keep it in this slab. Or then again, it might migrate to a bigger slab, who knows. So my next job is to use the very sticky Kato, which is a sticky mud, to build a wall around here. And then I'll use the akadama, put it in place, and then I've got moss to dress the top, which will hold everything in place.